Good morning, everybody. So it was a couple of years ago that I was approached by a couple who wanted to get married and wanted me to perform the wedding. So I sent them the various paperwork and documents that they need to fill out, which they returned to me. And in looking through the documents, that is just standard procedure when somebody wants to get married Jewishly. They have to provide proof of their Jewishness, their birth certificates, parents' Ketubah, which is usually the proof that they're Jewish, and they have to fill out a form with details about themselves. So I noticed something, that a little bit of a discrepancy, that the name of the bride-to-be was different as she introduced herself compared to what was written on her birth certificate, a different surname. She was single and hadn't been married before, so it wasn't a married name, and so it just seemed unusual that her name was different from birth as it was at the current time. And so when I met up with them, I asked, explain what's the story with the names. So she said that she, on her birth certificate, obviously has her name as she was born, but she has actually formally changed her name since then, because her father had abandoned the family many years ago, and her mother had remarried, and she'd grown up with her mother's husband as her stepfather, but really as a father. And she saw him as his father, her father. He had formally, legally adopted her as well as a daughter, and so she'd taken on his surname. And so even though her birth name was different, but this is her current name. And in fact, she then produced a new birth certificate that had been redone. Her birth certificate had been redone with a new name, the name of her adopted father, which you can do. And so that explained it, no problem, that's all fine. But then she said that she wanted to know, in the wedding ceremony, she was aware that in the Ketubah, the Hebrew marriage document that will be prepared for her and for her wedding, so the law is that you write the Hebrew name of the groom and the bride, and the way it's written is their Hebrew name, the son or the daughter of their father, the father's Hebrew name. That's one of the details that I ask for in the paperwork to get the correct names to write in the Ketubah. And this is a halachic process. The Ketubah is an important halachic document. It has to be written correctly and accurately. Names have to be written and spelt in the right way. If somebody has two Hebrew names, they have to be included. If somebody is from the tribe of Levi, a Levite or a Cohen, that also has to be put in there. If they're not, it shouldn't be put in there. So it's a halachic thing. She was aware that that's how it's done, and she wanted to know if it's possible to have her adopted father's name in the Ketubah as opposed to her biological father. And the reason she gave, obviously, was because her biological father she has nothing to do with. She hasn't had anything to do with him since she was a baby. He, after all, abandoned the family, and so she didn't really have any inclination to honor him by having him mentioned in the Ketubah, and in fact felt a bit disturbed by the idea that this father should be mentioned in her Ketubah. And on the other hand, she felt very strongly she wants to be associated and identified as the daughter of her adopted father, who really has brought her up and has been totally dedicated to the family. And she was also sensitive to his feelings and wanted that his name should be mentioned in the Ketubah as the father, as opposed to basically a stranger who happens to be her biological father. So she wanted to know if that's possible to be done in the Ketubah. So to answer her, I had to do some research to find out if it can, because I was aware of the fact that the Ketubah does have to be written accurately. You can't write something false in a Ketubah, and so if you write this person is the child of that person, it has to be true. It can't be metaphorically true, it has to be literally true. And part of the reason why we write the name of the father in the Ketubah is in order to establish the lineage of the bride and the groom, to know who they are, family-wise. And so it's not so simple to just say because of feelings or emotions or sensitivities, you can just change the names in the Ketubah. It's not such a simple thing. So I had to look into the idea of whether this is possible. And in doing that, it opens up an entire area, a fascinating area of Jewish law, and that is the general attitude, laws, possible pitfalls and issues that are connected with adoption. when a child is adopted to an adoptive parent. And it's a fascinating area in Jewish law. It's dealt with quite extensively by many of the halachic authorities over the ages. Adoption is obviously not a new thing. It's been going on since the beginning of time. And so Jewish law, like every issue, has analyzed it, pulled it apart, and pointed out the areas that need to be addressed and taken care of. And so I want to share with you some of the issues, the questions, and the halachic aspects of adoption. First of all, it should be made very clear that throughout Torah, adoption is seen as an extremely respectable and honorable thing to do. To adopt a child and to take a child into your home is considered a great blessing and a huge mitzvah. The Talmud says that somebody who brings up a child in their own home is considered as if they parented that child, as if they gave birth to the child. You're given that same merit. It also says anyone who teaches Torah to somebody else's child, it's like you gave birth to that child. So providing a child with a home, with safety, with love, and with devotion, and providing a child with an education, with values, with meaning, with direction in life, all these things are as equal to giving birth. As great an event it is to give birth to a child, to actually bring a person into life, that's talking about physical life, but bring them into emotional life as well, or spiritual life. That is also considered parenting and considered a very virtuous thing to do. And there are several cases throughout Tanakh of people adopting other people's children, bringing them up as their own, and it's always seen as a meritorious and very respectful thing to do. One classic case is that the greatest prophet of all times, Moses, grew up in an adoptive home. Batya, the daughter of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the enemy of the Jewish people, adopted Moses, seeing him floating along the Nile, and brought him into her home. Even though he did actually go back to his mother and was nursed and weaned by his mother, but still, Batya is considered to having adopted Moses. In fact, the name that Batya chose for Moses, which is Moshe, who was drawn from the water, that's the name he's known by. Moses has 10 different names, including ones that his own parents gave him, but those names are not used. The only name that we use for Moses is Moshe, the one drawn from the water, which was Batya's name that she gave him. In fact, her name, Batya, is also interesting. Batya means the daughter of God. And so the Midrash says that because God said to Batya, because you took a child not of your own, I will take you as my daughter as well. And so she was called Batya. So that's just one example of several in the Torah of where people taking another child into the home has been considered a very meritorious deed. In fact, halachically, it could even be considered that you fulfilled the obligation of having children. It's the first mitzvah. Out of the 613 mitzvahs, the very first one is to be fruitful and multiply. And so even though the simple explanation of that means to have biological children, but according to many opinions, you could fulfill that mitzvah if for whatever reason biological children are not granted to you. By adopting a child, it could be considered that you've fulfilled the mitzvah of being fruitful, of bringing up a child. This is derived from a Talmudic story that talks about a certain rabbi. His name was Ben Azai, and he was an extremely gifted scholar who dedicated himself to Torah learning to the extent where he refused to get married. And when asked, why aren't you getting married, he said, because I am so dedicated to Torah. That's where my passion is. So I can't get involved with marriage and family and these type of things. It's just not my thing. Now, even though his path was not encouraged and is not seen as the right choice to make, however, he was not considered a sinner because he taught Torah. He was a teacher of Torah to many children and the next generation, and so therefore it's seen that he was propagating the people, even though he didn't do it biologically. And so his case was an exception. I don't think many other people could really say that they're so occupied with Torah study that they can't possibly think of doing anything else. But nevertheless, because he was a teacher, that was seen as being a high thing, a high mission in his life. Interestingly also, just like it's a great honor to adopt a child and a great meritorious deed, the child has the obligation to respect the parents. Just like there's a mitzvah, a commandment in the Ten Commandments to respect one's biological parents, so to an adopted child has an obligation to respect their parents, possibly even in a greater way than biological parents, for the effort and the self-sacrifice that the parents have showed. At the same time, as meritorious and as special and unique as the relationship is between an adopted parent and a child, and as great as that deed is, it doesn't change the biological reality. We don't say that adopting a child makes them physically, literally your child. And so there are certain halachic ramifications to that. There are certain laws that are specifically between parent and child that do not apply to an adopted child. So, for example, a child adopted by a Cohen is not a Cohen. To be a Cohen, you have to be born from a Cohen family or a Levite. At the same time, the laws of incest, the forbidden relationships between family, don't apply to an adopted child, which we'll discuss later what that actually means. Where if an adopted parent passes away, so of course the child will mourn for that parent and will say Kaddish and observe the 7 days of mourning. However, they don't have the same obligation as a biological child would towards a parent. So even though they would certainly observe the laws of mourning, but let's say in certain communities, people have the custom that when in the year of mourning they lead the service during the weekdays. They're the chazan, they actually lead the service, the person who is in mourning. If, let's say, in a community where there are several people who are in mourning, so then you have to make a lottery or whatever, you have to choose who leads the service. An adopted child mourning for an adopted parent would not take precedent over a biological child mourning their biological parent, just as a halachic example. So there is a slight difference in the level of obligation of mourning, however they would still mourn for their parent. In the laws of inheritance as well, there's complicated laws in Judaism as to inheritance from parent to child. So there's an automatic inheritance that a child inherits from parents. If a person dies and does not have a will, so then Jewish law, like secular law, develops a system of where the inheritance goes towards, and a biological child automatically inherits from parents. Whether an adoptive child will automatically inherit from parents is an interesting question, because they're not the biological child. Now, of course, a parent can bequeath to an adoptive child, they can bequeath to anybody, but if there's no will the adopted child automatically inherit from the parent? So some opinions in Halacha say yes, that an adopted child will inherit from parents automatically, because by the very act of adopting a child through court, that could be the equivalent, halachically at least, of writing a will. If I've adopted this child, that's as good a statement as any as saying that this child is going to inherit my estate. So therefore it could be that an adopted child would automatically inherit from a parent who passed away if there's no will. So while there are certain discrepancies between biological and adopted children, but we do see that Halacha recognizes the bond between parent and child, and there are various obligations that are connected to that. An interesting question that always comes up in any case of adoption is: should the child be told? Should the children know that they're adopted? What would you think? Yes. Yes. Anyone think not? Yep, and?
Oh, no, she knew she was adopted, but she found out that she was adopted.
Yep. I think probably in older, like previous times, it was more common to not tell. These days, less common, probably, to not tell. And obviously not telling means that at a certain point, they probably will find out. If they find out on their own, if a child finds out on their own that they're adopted and the parents didn't tell them, that's probably not going to be very good. If the parent tells them at a certain stage, that's going to be also very difficult. It's going to be a difficult thing to discuss with an adult child or a grown-up child. And on the other hand, maybe if they don't find out and never find out and no one knows about it, so then what's the difference? They're the child of the parent. Who cares about the details? You could argue that way as well, and there are opinions just in secular thinking, not talking about here halachic thinking, in secular thinking there are opinions both ways, whether it's the right to tell them or not to tell them. In Jewish law, it seems that it would be necessary and important for the child to know that they're adopted. And that is because even though emotionally and spiritually the connection between the adopted parent and the child is a parent and child relationship, but because this child does have a biological family, there are certain laws that are relevant to that, to their biological family, such as the laws of incest. That would be forbidden to marry their sister or their brother, and so an adopted child does need to know that they have a biological family out there, and that information will be important. Otherwise, there is the very remote possibility, but not impossible, that one day they might meet somebody and have a lot in common and fall in love, and it actually is their brother or their sister, and that obviously would be a very, very difficult thing and a terrible thing to happen. Also, in the case where the adopted child was from a non-Jewish family and was converted to Judaism, which we'll discuss soon in detail, so it's important that the child knows that they converted, because a convert to Judaism is restricted to marry a Kohen. A convert cannot marry a Kohen. And so even a child who was converted as a child cannot marry, if it's a girl, cannot marry a Kohen when they grow up. They need to know that detail. It's an important thing to know. Another issue that comes up and makes it important for the child to know that they're adopted is that, when brought up, and this is discussed by the different halachic authorities, that there is a law in Judaism restricting physical contact between the sexes, that apart from immediate family, a man and a woman are not supposed to have physical contact, hug, kiss, and touch each other. They're also restricted in being isolated in a room together. That a man and a woman who are not married to each other, not related to each other directly, should not be enclosed in a private space together. It's considered inappropriate. So what about an adopted child with their adopted family? They're not biologically related, but on the other hand, they've grown up as a family. So can a mother kiss her adopted son? I mean, one would say, of course, how could you say not? But on the other hand, they're actually not related. They're not physically, biologically related. So this question has come up and been discussed, and there are lenient opinions that say that they can. And here they say, particularly if the child doesn't know they're adopted. If they're not aware of the adoption, so then in their feeling, this is their mother, so then there's no issue whatsoever. And there are lenient opinions to say that they can. There are strict opinions that say that they can't as well. It's halachic. There are different opinions on that one. Whether an adopted child, once they've grown up, not talking about a little kid, we're talking about once they're past the bar bat mitzvah, or even slightly younger than that, if they can touch each other, they can touch their adopted mother or father. So that would depend on their knowing it or not. Their knowing that they're adopted. A bigger question around adoption in Judaism is what is a better idea, or what is more appropriate, or what is the difference between adopting a child that's Jewish or a child that's not Jewish? For a Jewish family to adopt a Jewish child, or a child that is born not Jewish, and then to convert them. So there are interesting issues and ramifications to both options. And in some ways, it's easier this way, some ways it's easier that way. If it's a Jewish child that's being adopted, so there are big questions as to the family of origin of the Jewish child. Why are children put up to adoption generally? Why does it happen? So there are many possibilities. Sometimes the parents have died in some horrible accident or disease or whatever it was, and so this child is simply an orphan and needs to find a home. Sometimes the circumstances of the birth of the child were awkward or immoral or embarrassing or difficult, and so for that reason the child was given up to adoption. The parent wasn't able to keep them. In some cases the parents were just either physically or mentally incapable of looking after the child, and so the child is put up for adoption. There are many possible reasons why a child is put up to an adoption. It will be important in Jewish law to know the circumstances of the birth of the child, because if it's a case where the parents simply can't look after the child, okay, so then it's a legitimate Jewish child who just needs to be brought up. But if the child was born as a result of some type of immoral relationship, such as if let's say there was an affair or some extramarital affair that caused the birth of this child, then the child will be what's called a mamzer. A mamzer is illegitimate according to Jewish law. That's talking about if a married woman became pregnant from somebody other than her husband, that child will be illegitimate. And an illegitimate child in Judaism is a very big issue, a very big problem, because they are restricted as to who they are allowed to marry. They're not restricted in any other way. They're completely Jewish and a part of the community, but a mamzer can only marry a fellow mamzer. And that is a very restrictive situation to be in. And so if a child is being adopted from a Jewish family, and the child was born in such a circumstance, it will be very important to know that fact. Yeah.
What if the child was born as a result of rape and the father did, it's a crime and the mother didn't know who the father was, what's the status?
Okay, so in any case where it's not known who the father is, so then it is known who the father is. Then it is known who the father is. If it's not known who the father is,
no, the father's not known because she,
correct. In any case where the father is not known who the identity of the father is, so then it will depend on the circumstances. Usually we will say that the majority of people are not Jewish. We assume the father is not Jewish, and a married woman who was impregnated by a non-Jewish man, the child is not considered is not a mamzer. It's only okay if it's a single girl. So then the identity of the father, whether the father's Jewish or not Jewish, won't make the child a mamzer. Illegitimate in Judaism doesn't mean the parents are not married. It means that the mother's married to somebody else. That's what's illegitimate. Unlike the civil definition of illegitimacy. So if a single girl became pregnant and had a child, that will not render the child a mamzer, and that won't be such an issue. It's only if a married woman becomes pregnant to somebody else. So that's where it will become complicated, where it's a Jewish parent. We need to know what the circumstances of the birth are. And as long as that's known, then it's not an issue, as long as we know what the situation is. In cases where we don't know, so then it also becomes a little bit difficult. What if the mother is not forthcoming with details of who the father is? She doesn't want to say. So we don't know the identity of the child. Or what if we don't even know the mother? We don't know who this child is. There was a child just left on a doorstep. So then that will also be complicated as to the background of that child. And there are certain halachic ways of approaching cases of doubt where we don't know who it is. If we don't know whether this child's Jewish or not at all, just left on the doorstep, so then it will probably go by majority rule. Majority are non-Jews, so it's assumed it's a not Jewish child, unless there's some indication otherwise. Like if the child was left on a synagogue doorstep, that might have a different indication. But it would depend on the situation, the circumstances. So in that way, adopting a Jewish child has its own complications that go with it. What about adopting a non-Jewish child? What's the story there? So in a way, that simplifies and takes out all those previous problems, all the issues of whether this child, if this child has a Jewish family somewhere as well. If it's adopted from if it's a Jewish child, maybe they have a Jewish brother or sister somewhere who they might end up marrying. That's another danger. We have to know their lineage. We have to know whether they're legitimate or illegitimate. That's all talking about a Jewish child. A non-Jewish child doesn't have those restrictions. We don't have those problems of legitimacy or illegitimacy. That's a particular Jewish issue. A non-Jewish child who then converts to Judaism, a convert to Judaism is considered a newborn child with a new slate, and so therefore spiritually and halachically, their family background is actually not relevant if in that case. So that issue is solved when adopting a non-Jewish baby. But the problem then is, how do we convert a child? Converting a child itself sounds at first to be an impossibility, because conversion to Judaism, there are several requirements to converting to Judaism. There's the technical requirements, and that is that if it's a boy, it has to be circumcised, and whether a boy or girl, it's immersed. The child is immersed in a mikveh. That is the conversion process. But apart from that, the other major requirement, central requirement to conversion, is a sincere acceptance of Judaism and of Jewish life. That the person converting is not only going through a technical process where they're circumcised and they dunk in a mikveh. There's also an internal identity process that they're going through, where they're taking on the Jewish identity and the Jewish lifestyle, and that has to be done with a clear mind, without any coercion, as a choice and as a informed decision. Such a decision cannot be made by a child. We cannot expect a child to make the decision that they want to change their identity and take upon themselves a Jewish life. A child is not of developed intellect enough to make such a decision, and so therefore, and certainly a newborn or a little baby is not able to do such a thing. So how can we convert a child? They can't make that decision. So one Talmudic answer to that is that there's the possibility of what's called a conversion that is based on the Jewish court's decision. Usually the person makes the decision to convert, but sometimes the Beis Din can make the decision for them. What does that mean? That a child could be circumcised and dunked in a mikveh, and the decision part of it was made by the Beis Din, the Jewish court, on their behalf. What does that mean? How can somebody else make a decision for you? So the idea is an interesting one. In the Talmud it says that there's a principle in Jewish law that says that I can give you a gift without you knowing it. I can't take away something from you without you knowing it. That's called stealing. But I can give you something without you knowing, without you being aware. I can, on your behalf, acquire something. So let's say somebody is giving away free gifts. I can take one for you on your behalf. Why not? I can accept something on your behalf, and it's halachically yours. Even though I accepted it on your behalf, it is halachically yours. So if you can give a gift for somebody, if you can give somebody something that is to their benefit without them even knowing it, so being Jewish is a benefit, it's a blessing. We believe it's a good thing to be Jewish. So to accept the gift of Jewishness for somebody on their behalf, even though they're not able to accept it themselves, is permissible. And so the Beis Din, the Jewish court, can accept Jewishness for that child on their behalf when they're in a state where they can't do it themselves. However, the child will then have to confirm that decision when they do reach majority age, which means bar or bat mitzvah, 13 for a boy, 12 for a girl. They will have to then confirm the decision that the Beis Din made on their behalf. So the conversion can happen at infancy, when the child is a baby, but the conversion is only confirmed and continued by the child themselves when that child grows to an age where they have enough rationale to make the decision, which is bar or bat mitzvah. That's a conversion process that is described in the Talmud. So in the case of converting a baby, such a thing could be done. They could be taken to the mikveh and they can continue the conversion if they want when they're bar or bat mitzvah. It has to be made clear that this is a process that has to be done with the Beis Din, with the Jewish court, and it's wrong that what happens in some communities is people adopt a non-Jewish baby and they just assume a Jewish family adopting a non-Jewish child, but you're adopted into our family now, legally adopted, so therefore you're Jewish. It doesn't work that way. If there was no conversion, if a conversion wasn't done, so then that child is not Jewish. Their biological parents are still their halachic parents, and unless there's a conversion that's done, unless they actually become Jewish, they remain a non-Jew. And so tragically, there could be a child that grows up in a Jewish family and goes to Jewish school and does everything with the Jewish community and always identifies with the Jewish community. If the conversion was not done, so then they're still not Jewish. And it doesn't matter how many years they've been going through it, it doesn't matter how much they know and how involved they are in the community, that won't matter until they actually do the conversion. Now, of course, somebody who grew up that way, If, let's say, somebody finds out they're 20 years old and they find out that they were adopted, or they knew they were adopted but they find out they were never converted. So obviously somebody who grew up with a Jewish identity and living a Jewish life and with some level of observance, it won't be difficult for that person to convert. So it's not as difficult a process as somebody who's coming in who doesn't know anything about Judaism. They grew up with it. They've got the identity, but they do need to observe Judaism in order to convert to Judaism. But somebody who's not observant of Judaism, doesn't live a Jewish life, and just grew up in a Jewish family, if there was no conversion that was done when they were young, so then they remain non-Jewish, and if they want to, they can, but they would have to go through a conversion process. Certainly, it's not enough to just give the child a bris, a circumcision, and that's it. This has to be done with the Beis Din, a proper conversion with mikveh as well. Now, the question is that in such cases of adopting a non-Jewish child and then converting them, so that's all very well if the family who adopted the child is themselves an observant family. They live a Jewish life. They keep Shabbos, they keep kosher, they keep the festivals, and it's a Jewish home. So that could work. But in a case where a family is completely not religious, Jewish culturally, but they don't live a religious life at all, so conversion for a child living in that home is going to be quite complicated, if not an impossibility, because conversion means living a Jewish life, living an observant Jewish life. It doesn't just mean culturally Jewish, and doing it little bits and pieces. It means living a fully observant Jewish life. And so the Beis Din, the Jewish court, cannot take responsibility and accept Judaism for a child who's going to grow up in a home that doesn't keep Judaism. For the simple reason that the whole logic behind converting a child when they're still a child is that you're giving them a gift, you're giving them something positive. But converting a child to grow up in a family that's not observing Judaism is not giving them a gift, it's making problems for them. Because as a non-Jew, they're not obligated to keep kosher, they're not obligated to keep Shabbos, they don't have to do these things. And so a non-Jewish child, even grow up in a Jewish home, doesn't have to keep anything. But if you're converting the child to Judaism, and then sending them back to a home that is not going to keep the laws of Judaism, you're not giving them a gift, you're giving them more problems, because they're obligated now in Judaism and they're not keeping it. So that certainly cannot be considered giving a gift to them, and so it can't be done. And so therefore they'd be much better off remaining non-Jewish and staying that way. What they could do is they could be not Jewish and then make the decision when they're older if they want to convert or not. That's totally up to them. But you cannot convert somebody to live a secular Jewish life. Conversion is a religious process. It has to be to live a religious life. So therefore that would be a complicated case. Now, even in the case where we do convert a child, so as I said, the Beis Din is taking responsibility for their Jewishness, giving them the gift of Jewishness, but they do have to confirm that gift when they bar or bat mitzvah. Now, what that means is that they can decide not to. If a child was converted and then at their bar or bat mitzvah they decided they don't want to be Jewish, it's their choice. You cannot enforce it on them. It's something that they have to decide. Of course, if they're brought up in a happy, observant, positive Jewish environment, more likely they're going to want to continue it. It'll be very unusual for them to reject it. But nevertheless, it is their choice and it's up to them. Now, there's an interesting discussion in Jewish law as to the nature of this confirmation of conversion. Is it that there are two opinions. One opinion is that what they need to do is they need to actively embrace Judaism at their bar or bat mitzvah. They have to live a Jewish life. Another opinion is that no, that to reject it, they have to actively reject it. That they have to go and eat not kosher, just around their bat mitzvah or bar mitzvah age. They have to go and eat not kosher or break Shabbos or do something that shows that they're not interested in being Jewish. Now this is a very big difference if they have to actively positively accept Judaism or if they have to negatively reject it. There's a big difference between the two, because what if they do neither? What if it comes to bar bat mitzvah age and they don't do anything particularly Jewish or particularly not Jewish. They don't actively accept Judaism. They don't make any statement that they want to be Jewish, but they also don't go out and eat not kosher and do anything rebellious either. So what's the status of this child? Is it that the conversion that happened when they were a baby made them Jewish, and they'll stay Jewish, and then at Bar Bat Mitzvah, as long as they don't do anything, they remain Jewish? Or is it that the conversion that they did as a baby was a conditional conversion, that they're not actually fully yet Jewish, and only when they reach Bar Bat Mitzvah do they have to actively accept it upon themselves? So it was the beginning of a conversion, but it was only concluded at Bar Bat Mitzvah. That's the difference between whether they, at Bar Mitzvah, have to actively reject it to lose their conversion, or do they have to actively accept it to confirm their conversion. There are different opinions on that. It's not clear from the Talmud which one it is, and so that leaves it a bit in the air. What is the nature of the conversion of a child? And so it's interesting, in a discussion by Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who's one of the great halachic authorities from the previous century. He lived in New York towards the end of the 20th century. So he has a long discussion about this conversion of children, and he's not. He doesn't really take one side or the other as far as whether the conversion is a retroactive one from the bar mitzvah, or if it starts from the infancy. But his advice is to not do the conversion at all and wait till the child grows up and let them make the choice themselves. That's his advice. That you should leave it to the child when they grow up and they're older, they can choose a conversion or not. But that's not the common practice. More common practice is to convert children who are growing up in an observant family, and then they can confirm it or reject it when they get older. Now, so just to summarize those issues of conversion and adoption, that civil adoption is not a conversion, that's clear, and it's only going to really work if the parents themselves are observant. If they're not observant, so then a conversion doesn't really make any sense. And either way, even if that conversion does happen, the child will have to confirm or continue their Jewishness at Bar Bat Mitzvah. Any questions on that part?
So the average Jewish family is not observant, who adopts a non-Jewish child, and in order to convert the children needs to show that it's an observant household and they're not interested or prepared to do that, then that child is halakhically not Jewish, and then they have to they go through the same process as any convert when they're older. Yes.
Yep. So that child is not. I mean, just by adopting them, they're not Jewish. If the family's not observant, so then to convert them doesn't make any sense. You're converting them to do what? So that child will be a non-Jewish child. And then as a teenager, even they could, after their bar bat mitzvah, once they're able to make a decision on their own, they could choose to convert. Still, if they're living at home, it would probably be difficult even to convert a teenager who's living at home in a non-observant home, but it's possible. That's already possible. A baby, it's not possible. That would go through the same conversion process as anybody else. Like I said, because they've grown up with a Jewish identity, so then that would make some of the process a bit easier, as compared to somebody who didn't have a Jewish identity growing up at all. But as far as observance, that might not be easier for them, because they actually have to observe Judaism. That's an essential part of conversion, is taking on the Jewish life in practice, observing Torah law.
So could they have a bar mitzvah at the age of 12
a non-Jew can't have a bar mitzvah, can't be called up to the Torah, or can't do those type of things. So if they were not converted, then they couldn't. Yeah, that's right. So in other words, to have a culturally Jewish conversion, that you can't do. To have all the trappings, for them to sit at the Friday night table and to eat chicken soup and do, of course they can do everything in the family, but the conversion is a religious process.
Have that bar mitzvah as soon as they convert.
Correct.
To the teenager.
Correct. Yep.
With adoption, There's, we talked about certain obligations or leniencies based around who your biological parents compared to your adopted parents are. But there's no, unlike conversion, there's no clear-cut black and white process that says that, you know, this child from now on is going to be raised as part of my family or anything. You know, or similarly, a lot of the time children who are actually adopted, they might just live as foster care. So at what point, how do we pin down exactly when those obligations or leniencies come into play? Because there's no, what is adoption? Do you know what I mean?
Okay, so you're saying in civil law, there's a process, paperwork, and there's a whole thing of adoption. In Jewish law, what makes a person adopted? So really, I don't think in Jewish law there'd be any difference between a foster child and an adopted child. If you are bringing up, looking after, in charge of, responsible for this person in your house, that's halachic adoption, and that's when all this discussion would begin. In the case of conversion, what would be interesting is if the biological parents are around and alive and known, so then it will be a question whether can you convert this child without the parents knowing. That would be an interesting discussion, where the parents are people who are around. They have to have a say, or not. But I don't think there's no halachic ceremony of adoption. It's just looking after the kid. That's it. Sorry?
It's looking after the child grows up.
Yeah, that's right. And so while you're obligated to look after your own biological children, by taking an adopted child, you're opting to look after the child. But by doing that, you're taking on the responsibility of that child. So you are responsible for them.
So there's no actual paperwork?
Halachically,
But then you might be able to jump in. But with the Ketubah, where does that?
okay. Well, yeah, we'll get into that. We'll get into that soon. So, generally speaking, in Jewish tradition, a person's name they're identified by being a son or daughter of their father, or sometimes their mother, depending on what the circumstances or the context is. That's generally how people are identified. So, can an adopted child be identified as the son or the daughter of their adopted parents? Or do they need to always be called the son or daughter of their original parents, assuming that the original parents were Jewish? So, it depends on what we're talking about. When writing a halachic document, such as a get, a Jewish divorce, or a ketubah, a Jewish marriage certificate, so there are very specific laws as to what you can and cannot write. And it has to be exact and accurate and true. And so if let's say somebody wrote a get, a divorce paper, and they got the father's name wrong. They wrote this person, not about adoption, in any case, but this person's name, the husband's name was Yitzchak ben Avraham, but they got confused, and instead of writing Avram, they wrote Yaakov. They wrote a different name. So he just got the name wrong. That will invalidate that divorce paper. That divorce will be invalid because it's got the wrong name on it. It's not the right person. Like, this person is not Yitzchak ben Yaakov, it's Yitzchak ben Avraham. And so by writing the wrong name, the entire divorce paper is invalid, which means the divorce didn't happen. The divorce in Jewish law happens through the paper being written correctly and being handed from husband to wife. So if a divorce is not done properly, they're not divorced, they're actually still married until the divorce is done correctly, which means that if this woman goes off and finds somebody else and has a child, she's having a child with somebody else while she's still married to her husband because the get didn't happen, and that child is therefore a mamzer and all the other problems that are associated with it. It's a serious thing. Writing a get has to be done very carefully. It's not done lightly, and one of the most important parts of a get is identifying who the parties are by their name. And in fact, if a get also writes all the nicknames and all other names that are used, but every name possible is put into the get, English names and Hebrew names. So the wrong name is a big problem.
Hopefully not the nicknames that the spouses call it.
Yeah, no, those type of names. That's usually just verbally shared, but not put into writing. So if somebody is in a situation where they were adopted, they're now getting divorced, and the rabbi is writing the get and says, "What's your name?" and they give the name of their adopted father. Well, hang on a minute, that's actually not their biological father. Is that going to invalidate the get now? It might. You can't just write the wrong name. So there was a case where a man divorced his wife and used his adoptive father's name on the divorce paper. That's exactly that case where he was adopted, and instead of putting his biological father's name, he told the rabbi his adopted father's name and gave the get. It was discovered that the get had this issue in it. The problem was this man then had disappeared off the face of the earth. No one knew where he was. He'd gone. So the woman who had been married to him and was supposed to be divorced from him is now in a real bind. If this divorce is no good, so then she's still married to him. And he's disappeared. So they can't just do a new divorce paper and just get the name right this time, because he's gone, he's disappeared. And if she can't get divorced, that means she can't get married, because she will always be married to this guy who has disappeared, and they can't find him. So there was a halachic authority who, in this case, he said the get is kosher. He validated this get as saying it's a good get. And the reason he said was because he quoted the Talmud that we said earlier, and that says that whoever brings up somebody in their home, it's as if you gave birth to them. So the adopted father who brought up this person who had been orphaned, in this case from his biological father, because he brought it up in his home, so the Talmud says it's like you gave birth to him. So if it's like you gave birth to him, we can write that he is the son of him. It's like he gave birth. It's not false. It's not a lie. It's not a not true thing. It's a true thing, and so therefore that's acceptable. And he validated that divorce paper. And there are some who disagree with that. This particular rabbi, his name was the Rabbi Halevi, he validated that get. There are others who would have disagreed and said that no, when it says in the Talmud that it's as if you gave birth to a child if you brought them up, as if you gave birth to them is not changing the reality. It's saying that you're given, it's like that. It has the same merit. It's just as meritorious to bring up a child that's not yours as if you gave birth to them. It doesn't change the fact, and therefore you can't put the son of this. It's not a truth. You have to be careful. There are many sayings in the Talmud that are moralistic teachings as opposed to legalistic teachings. Right? There's a statement of law, of what the law is, and then there's statements of what upright and good and the right way to live. When the Talmud made a statement that anyone who brings up an orphan, it's as if you gave birth to them, it's not making a legalistic statement that you'll legally become the parent. It's making a statement of morality, that it's such an act of love and dedication, you're bringing up that child. So others have said you can't use a moralistic teaching in the Talmud and make a legalistic decision based on that, and are not happy with that. But a similar case happened where a woman's father was written in the get, but it was a mistake in that case. Here it wasn't a case of adoption. It was a case where the woman's name was written as the daughter of her father, but she just got the name wrong. It was just a mistake. And it was an incorrect name. You know, sometimes you ask somebody what their father's Hebrew name is, they come up with a name, you know, because his name was, in English, his name was Jerry, so they thought Jacob, Yaakov, they called him Yaakov. But that wasn't his Hebrew name. In fact, he was given a different Hebrew name. So it was a mistaken case. So there was an authority, the Avodas HaGershuni was his name, who said that the get is okay. And the reason why is because theoretically, if you left it blank and you didn't write the father's name at all in the get, it would be kosher. And so he said that anything in the get that didn't have to be there at all, if it is there mistakenly, it doesn't invalidate the get. That was his opinion. Because you could have left out the name, so when you put it in wrongly, a wrong name is not worse than no name at all. That was his logic, and so he validated that get. However, again, not all opinions would agree with that. that assumption. And so the ideal case would be this, that if it was written in the get, the adopted father's name, but with the word, who adopted him or her, if it actually expressly said that in the get, that would be okay. As long as the get is true and accurate in what it's writing, so then there's no question at all. So you could put, if there was the boy's name was Yitzchak, and he was born from Avram, but he's been adopted by Yaakov, so then if you put Yitzchak ben Yaakov, Hamagadli, the son of Yaakov who brought him up, or who adopted him, if you write that in the get, so then you've avoided all problems. That won't be an issue at all, because the get has to reflect truth. And so even though there were cases where they found ways around it when the name was put there as if it's the biological father, if you specify that it's adopted father, so then that would certainly be okay. That won't be a problem.
Is that the same for a wedding?
So in the laws of a ketubah, ketubah is, a lot of those laws are learnt out from the laws of get. In other words, the laws of the divorce are more explicit, and we derive from there the laws of the ketubah. And so therefore, yes, the same thing would apply, that in a ketubah, as long as you wrote Hamagadloi or Hamamtza, the one who brought him up, then that would be kosher. And that was the answer to this, the couple that I met, that they were able to write the adopted father's name as long as it says Hamagadloi. And we'll talk about it a bit later as well.
So does the wording of the name as a ketubah have to exactly match the wording in a get?
Assuming they're correct, if the ketubah was written correctly, so then the get has to match it. If the ketubah was written incorrectly, then the get doesn't have to match the ketubah, the get has to be correct.
Okay. So it's not a matter, it's not kind of like a sort of, a mix and match thing when you say, well, this cancels out this, and it's got to match exactly.
No. And theoretically, it could be on the ketubah it has the adopted father's name, and on the get it has the biological father's name. It could do such a thing. So that's talking about a get, and the same would apply to a ketubah. That as long as it's accurate and it's explicit, so then it would definitely be kosher. It will be fine. What about being called up to the Torah? For a man, when a man is called up to the Torah, they're called, their Hebrew name, the son of their father. So does an adopted child have to be called up by their biological father's name, or can they be called up by their adopted father's name? If so, do you also have to say every time they're called up to the Torah, this person, son of that person who adopted him? Does that have to be said every single time? So there was a case in Jewish law of what if a similar case but slightly different. What if somebody doesn't know who their father is? So they simply don't know who their father is. How are they called up to the Torah? So there are two opinions. One opinion is that they should be called up as the son of their mother's father. Right? They don't know who their father is, so they could be called up by their mother's father's name. So their grandfather. Now, even though you're calling them up as son of, not grandson of, but there is a principle in Jewish law that grandchildren are in some ways considered like children. It's an extension of the family. And so therefore, to call it ben, the word child means, can also include grandchild. So you could say that this person is the son of that person, even though you're actually talking about their grandfather. That's how they should be called up to the Torah. That's one opinion, the Ramah. The Taz, who's another halachic authority, disagrees and says that when you don't know the father's name, you should call up the person as the son of Abraham, because we're all children of Abraham, our forefather, and so calling the person the son of Abraham, that covers it. That's what you should call them. Now, in the case of adoption, so we could compare it to that and say, well, if you can call the person up by their grandfather, why can't you call them up by their adopted father? That should also be okay. In fact, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, again, the more recent halachic authority, he says that you can call up an adopted child as the son of their adopted father without any explanation. You don't have to add who adopted them or anything at all. Just you can call them as that child. There's no reason to actually mention that they're adopted. Why, in the case of a get or a ketubah, we say you do have to mention it, whereas being called up to the Torah you don't? Well, the difference is that one of them is a certificate, is a document that is going to be used as proof of this person's lineage. And so if it doesn't say clearly that the person is adopted, so then it could be confusing or misleading as to the person's lineage. Whereas when you're calling someone up to the Torah, so we're not establishing any halachic facts here. This is not documentation. It's just naming a person who's been called to the Torah. So therefore, to be so exact and so accurate is not necessary when you're calling to the Torah, as opposed to when you're making a halachic document. It could be in some cases it could be necessary to say something, and that would be, what if a Cohen adopted a non-Cohen? So the father is a Cohen, and he adopted a non-Cohen son. So let's say the son's name is Aaron, and his father's name is Pinchas, and so his adopted father's name is Pinchas. Pinchas is a Cohen, and Aaron is not. So then you're going to call him Aaron ben Pinchas a Cohen, but you're calling him up not as a Cohen, you're calling him up to the third or the fourth call-up, which is not a Cohen. So that's just going to be confusing and misleading, and why are you calling him up then? That will also start to make people think, well, maybe the father's not really a Cohen, because his son is getting called up at a non-Cohen call-up, and so that brings into question what the father's father is. Or it will make people think, oh, he is a Cohen, and so then they'll treat him like a Cohen and give him the honors of a Cohen, which are not appropriate. So maybe there, in a case where the father is a Cohen and the adopted father and the son not, maybe there you would have to put in another word to clarify why he's been called up as a non-Cohen. So Hamagad, the one who brought him up, or the one who adopted him. But in other cases where it's not an issue, it's not such an issue. In the case of the Ketubah, which was the case we started with, so there's another interesting part of that, and this is something that doesn't apply so much to the get. If in a get, let's say, somebody who is adopted is called an adopted child in the get, so that's not such an issue, because a get is done privately, it's a private affair. A ketubah, the marriage document, is read out at the wedding. A part of the chuppah ceremony is you actually read it out. And so if in the ketubah it actually specifies that this person is the son of that person who adopted him or her, or the daughter of, so that is making a public statement, which sometimes could be uncomfortable. There are cases where the child knows they're adopted, but not everyone knows that, and it's not necessarily spoken about and advertised and publicized in every place, and it doesn't need to be. If in the ketubah you need to write that this person was adopted, so then at their wedding it's going to be read out and mentioned that they're adopted. Now, most people at a wedding don't know what is being said and don't understand the ketubah, but some people do, and in some places people understand the ketubah. And so to read out the ketubah in a way that is specifying this person is adopted could be uncomfortable for the adopted parent, for the adopted child, for everybody. So their Jewish law says very clearly that when reading the ketubah you can miss out the word adopted. You don't have to read it out publicly if it's not wanted. And that's because the reading of the ketubah is not like the writing of the ketubah. It has to be written accurately, and you can't miss out a word when you write the ketubah. But when you're reading the ketubah, that doesn't have any halachic status really, the reading out of the ketubah. If the names were read wrong when reading the ketubah, it actually wouldn't really matter. If they're written wrong, it does matter. So in the reading of the ketubah, the rabbi could just skip out that word completely, and that would be completely fine. That would not be a problem at all, and so there'd be no discomfort. And so going back to the case that I started with this particular couple who came to me, it was a sensitive issue. The biological father was off the scene, and the daughter had no desire for him to be mentioned in the ketubah at the wedding. She did want her adopted father to be mentioned, to honor him and to include him, because that is the father that she always knew. And so I was able to tell her that yes, absolutely, he can be put in the ketubah. Your adopted father is mentioned, your biological father not. It does have to specify that in the ketubah, but in a way that nobody's going to know, nobody's going to realize. It's not going to be read out loud. It'll be read smoothly like any other ketubah. And so therefore, your adopted father, who is for you your father, who's the person you recognize as your father, will be honored and recognized at your wedding according to your desire. All right. Any questions before we end up? Yeah.
Is it ever okay in the ketubah to go by the mother's name?
In a case where the father's not Jewish, the mother's Jewish and the father's not Jewish, then you would mention the mother. If that's not the case, so then mentioning the mother makes it sound like the father's not Jewish. So it actually changes the lineage, because the Ketubah has to be an accurate expression of the lineage of the person.
It has to be through the male.
Yeah,
Through the male.
yeah. Because your tribal affiliation is through the male.
More correct to go by the grandfather's name if, say, he was the one who brought up the child, than to go by the mother's name. That's a more accurate.
Yep, correct. Yeah. Okay.
Two questions. One, when you spoke about coins, the coin who adopted non-coin, when you went to Aaron, when he became coin, his status was elevated. Can it happen today?
No, you can't become a Cohen. You can't unless you're born a Cohen. It happened once. Aaron was instated as a Cohen, but there's no way to get.
Someone into that status.
Yeah. You have to be born it, and that's it.
The other question is, after I was university for one lesson, she belonged with a girl who was adopted by a Jewish woman, and the girl was funny enough gypsy girl, almost so black, dark. When we were kids, obviously didn't matter, but then when we started growing up, we realized that she's different than us. And my question is, what's her status? Is she Jewish? She was adopted as a baby.
So that we mentioned earlier, that she has to convert. Just adopting doesn't make her Jewish. There has to be a conversion. Yeah.
Back to the mom's actually say, if it's a married the child is still a mom, so it doesn't matter.
If it was a Jewish man, if it's not Jewish, then it's not a mamzer.
But if she doesn't,
And if she doesn't know, so then majority assume to be not Jewish. Okay, we'll stop there. So there's a lecture next door, Rabbi Friedman, I believe, and then next week I'm not going to do on the Monday morning. There's classes, but I'm not going to do one. And then on Tuesday there's the barbecue and the panel discussion. All the best.